Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Anna Rose Reads the podcast. I am your host, Anna, and this week we're getting a little spooky. That's right, we're heading into haunted territory. I'm talking to the very nice, very kind, very intelligent author Erika T. Wurth. Her book, The Haunting of Room 904, is on shelves today. And if you're a fan of paranormal mysteries, you'll definitely want to be picking this one up. Erika is also the author of another book that I love tremendously, White Horse, and we talk about her writing, how she plots, how she plans, the different ways that she arrives at different plot points of her story and her characters and their flaws and the things that they get right and the things that they get wrong. We talk about real world influences and the real world horrors that seem to really permeate the page with this novel, and a bunch of different other really, really interesting ideas and topics. So stay tuned. I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I did, as always. And yeah, let's have a very spooky time as we explore the haunting of room 904. Hi, Erica. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to get to chat with you. I have to say I am a huge fan of your previous novel, White Horse, and so whenever I saw that The Haunting of Room 904 was coming out this year, I was incredibly excited. But in case people don't know you, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself for anybody who's not aware of your work, your book, and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Erika T. Wurth. I'm author of White Horse and the forthcoming The Haunting of Room 904. I guess some of the highlights for me were are that I was a New York Times. I got a singular rave review, and they did me. I think there was a New York Times pick. I was a Target Book of the Month pick, and an Indie Next, and I was on Good Morning America. So a lot of really wonderful things happened for me with White Horse. And I'm an Indigenous paranormal novelist. I guess I'm technically under the rubric of horror, but I'm more ghosts than slasher. So yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you kind of bring up an interesting point, with the different distinctions, and there's not really any hard set rules for this kind of thing. So one of my questions that I had planned for you, and this works out really well that you mentioned it, is a little bit of the distinction between, paranormal and horror or thriller or all these little different kind of subcategories that we give to the genre. So what's your definition for those?
Yeah, the other thing that I do is I did a PhD in creative writing and literature. So I sometimes write for the Writers Chronicle, and the scholar in me loves to make these distinctions that probably other people are like, ew, about, but I just can't help it. I love that stuff. And I think it's also technically useful because, I teach creative writing. I think sometimes people are like, I just don't have a sense of what I'm doing, and I need these more concrete tools. So I try to provide that with craft books and books on structure and plot, but yeah, I find that stuff really interesting. And speaking of the Writers Chronicle, I just did a conversation where I invited Rachel Harrison and my friend Carolina Flores. Gosh, I'm forgetting her second part of her last name, but her new book is called Bochica.
Oh
She's a
yeah.
debut novelist, and Paul Tremblay. And I was kind of talking about that because one of the writers whom I really admire and I think is really interesting, who I think is sort of literary and horror, Sylvia Moreno Garcia,
Yeah.
who I think has a lot of commercial success, was essentially saying that in the late aughts and especially or late 90s and early aughts, horror was out of fashion. And unless you're talking about Stephen King, people were not going to buy it, or at least, people thought they weren't. So they were labeling everything psychological thrillers, right? Like Silence of the Lambs, which in many ways is a horror book. But I guess for me, because I'm kind of a geek and I started out, liking fantasy and sci fi, and, if it didn't involve a ghost or a dragon or a spaceship, I was like, what is this? I, for me, horror, the difference between crime and horror is that there's a supernatural element. But my friend Carolina, she was saying in the interview something I thought was really interesting and very much more concrete than what I'm talking about, which is that crime, right? The plot is oriented at crime. And with horror, the plot is oriented around, fear. And those are just more simplistic ways of putting it. And even though I don't find slashers scary, I think, like I saw The Monkey last night and it was funny, it wasn't scary. people love it, right? Because for them, that's what horror is. For me, it is, the paranormal because that's truly frightening, and interesting and compelling. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And speaking for myself as a reader, sometimes it is helpful to have the different distinctions just so you kind of know whatever you're walking into. But I also am somebody who subscribes to like genre is fluid. Like it's hard to put a defined thing on a story because a story can be multiple things to multiple people. And kind of bringing it back too, as well as what seems scary. I agree. Like there is a certain kind of fear associated with slashers. But moreover, I find like the psychological components, the emotional examinations, those like really deep kind of character studies sometimes are the ones that really freak me out more because you're sitting with more reality than you are fantastical sometimes. So, and horror is different for everybody. So that's just for me, you know?
Absolutely. I actually, the other day, I was like purposely tongue in cheek because you can't assign a gender to a genre. But I was like, there's kind of boy horror and there's girl horror. And to me, boy horror is archetypally like the slasher stuff, right? Like cool guts, and girl horror is like dread and the paranormal and the afterlife and ghosts, things like that. And, to be clear, I think of like Josh Mallerman as girl horror and Stephen King is like 80% girl horror, right? And again, it's meant to be tongue in cheek, and it made a bunch of people mad on threads. I thought that was kind of funny. But I think like it's because, like you say, I'm very interested in hybrid genre because I'm somebody who wrote what people call literary fiction for years. And I just grew really, really tired of it. I'm just kind of a geeky personality, and I wanted to come back to who I actually am in that way. But I still like to think like I do the things that, are literary, which are complex characterization, depth of theme, and attention to form and language. Those are the things I care about, whatever genre I'm writing in. So
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of bring this back to how it applies to your book specifically, I'd love to talk about The Haunting of Room 904. Do you want to, I hate to always ask this question because it's such an easy question, but it kind of opens up, and we can talk a little bit more from here, the inspiration for the story, kind of where the story began for you, your journey in writing it, your approach, all those good things. If you want to speak to that, I would absolutely love to hear about it.
yeah, White Horse is kind of an easier log line, right? Because it's a woman, who's like an urban native. She, hates the mother she thinks abandoned her. Her cousin finds a bracelet. She touches it. And lo and behold, her mother's ghost starts haunting her, and she has to figure out what happened to her mother after all. The Haunting of Room 904, I've had a little bit more trouble making into a boiled down log line because the plot really is a bear. And some people have liked that, and some people have not. And that's totally okay. I think I was trying to do something very different than I was doing in White Horse, but still, bring my audience in. But yeah, the log line, if you will, is a woman with mysterious powers has 3 weeks to solve a paranormal crime or her mother dies, right? And so essentially, it's about a woman named Olivia who was getting her PhD in psychology. She's much more like her father, much more into science. Dad's white, mom is native, mom is a newspaper writer, and her sister is just a mess. She's addicted to various drugs. She's in and out of rehab. Finally, she is doing better. I think she becomes an accountant. This is what I did in the book. But she is kind of getting involved in what they realize is a cult, and it's this kind of weird paranormal cult. And the night that Olivia graduates, her sister calls her and says, if you don't come to the Brown Palace right now, I'm going to die. And Olivia's like, calm down, come to where I am. I'm drunk. And her sister, she wakes up and her sister is appearing to her, and it's obvious her sister is dead. She thinks her sister is suicided. It turns on her paranormal powers. Her academic career is destroyed. They've just lost their father to cancer a few years back, so her mom is destroyed. And so she decides, okay, I'm going to start a paranormal investigative business with my friend, Alejandro, who, needs insurance because he's gotten HIV. And he's smart and he's wonderful, and I want to live my life with him. So they do this, but then years later, the Brown Palace calls them back and says, we've got a paranormal crime we want you to solve. And Olivia goes in reluctantly, and they're like, oh, by the way, your sister is now haunting this room 904 that another ghost was haunting And she's like, no, just no, this is too traumatic. I'm not going to do this. And at a certain point, her mother checks into the hotel. And the problem is, when these women check in, at a certain point, they reappear in 904, and that's when they suicide, and the cycle repeats every 5 years. So her mother, when her mother checks in and reappears in 904, she realizes, I've got 3 weeks or my mother's going to die. So I have to solve this. So yeah.
Yeah. It's a really, like you said, there's a lot of moving parts to this plot. And there's a lot of different things that I picked on that I thought were really interesting and intriguing. But kind of since it's a little bit, at the end of what you're just talking about, I have to say horror with momentum or horror with pressure. Like, we've kind of seen it in just in a movies like with The Ring when you have a timeline, a deadline. I feel like that kind of horror feels a little different. Is that something like whenever you were approaching to write it, you were like, this ups the ante? Like, did you feel that from the writer's perspective as well?
100%. Like, I'm very, in some ways, like, there are a lot of moving parts to White Horse too. And yet, what I try to do, I'm probably not, I mean, in some ways, I think if people are reading my work, they could probably see it in turns if they're like really into it. But I would say that you can see the influence of David Lynch, but I'm not as weird as he is. I'm just not. But Lynch really loved his traditional beats, and I do too. And I think there's something to traditional story structure, and I'm not trying to push anyone into it. But I think that what happens is if you have weird elements or you have a lot of working parts, it's able to pressurize the narrative so that it's still compelling as long as you have compelling characters and the language isn't too obtuse but is still pretty. That's kind of what I aim for. But yeah, I love Chuck Palahniuk's oh gosh, I've forgotten his craft book, but I love him. He's a wonderfully weird guy. He's another one like people are like literary, and I'm like, he is horror, as is David Lynch, right? And so he had in his craft book, he described how to create a clock, which I understand for commercial writers is like, yeah, I know about that. Like I know how to create a clock and why it makes an audience, have this pressurized, intense experience. And I was fascinated with that. So yeah, I absolutely intentionally created a clock in The Haunting of Room 904.
Yeah, it just like added another layer of kind of like tension and, in essence, horror because, if you're racing the clock, it's another form of suspense. And so the other kind of thing too that you mentioned, and I kind of want to on this a little bit as well, is White Horse felt very, like a character examination, and in ways 904 does as well with Olivia. I mean, we learn a lot about Olivia, her internal struggles, her external struggles. But there's a lot more that I felt like happened plot wise with 904, and especially because it's a larger cast of characters. So, what does the writing approach look like whenever you're writing something like that? That's something, White Horse felt really gritty and personal. And I'd say that 904 wasn't, but just there was a little bit more action to it, I guess, and from sitting from the reader's seat on this. So, what was that like writing those two?
Yeah, I definitely, like I said before, to me, literary fiction, one of the big hallmarks is do you have complex characterization? And that's something I'll never let go. And my agent sometimes and I will go back and forth because she wants less inner monologue and I want a little bit more because I think that's important to a rich story. There's a part of me that's always going to be jealous of these books that have, like less in terms of depth of the characterization and, just sort of move really quickly and fast. Because I feel like maybe they just have more commercial success, but I can only be the writer that I can be, even though I work hard to develop what I can to make what I do better. I think how I start is, in literary circles, they'll say, oh, plot's silly and structure's silly and there's no point to it. It's very Hollywood. In commercial structures, they're all about only traditional beats and, limiting that inner monologue, limiting that description, etc. I think that what I do, and it might come as a surprise, I read lots of craft books, Thrill Me by Benjamin Percy, Suspense Structure and Plot by Jane Cleland. But I always do start with Save the Cat. You know why?
Mhm.
Because I was trained in academia and we were taught to do everything but talk about plot. And I just wanted to know where somebody would put anything, you know? So I do have a sort of like Save the Cat beat sheet. And then I do have like this happens in chapter one, this happens in chapter two. Does that beat sheet change? God, yes. Especially 904 was just a goddamn disaster, really. Like that I handed to my editor, and I was like, Here you go. And it just required a ton of revision. And I think that's the other thing that I've sort of accepted over the years, that I think like, oh, I'm just going to get so much better this than this. I'm not going to have to do that. And I'm realizing now, like, no, it's okay. It's all right that it's a disaster. Like the book I'm working on now, I'm handing to an editor, and we're just working on the first 50 pages. And she liked the premise, she liked the writing, but she was like, if you just put this here and that there, and I was like, she's completely right. So it's okay. The art part of it isn't in my mind like, oh, why do we have to have a catalyst? Because it's fun. That's why. Because it kicks the book off. That's why. The art part of it is allowing it to change along the way, as many times as is necessary to make it a better book, But I think like just, before I love to believe this idea that you could just like have an idea and just start writing. Well, it's a disaster. And books like that, like in my opinion, are just, they're people kind of being like, I'm a genius. I just am, and it'll happen. And I'm like, you know what? How about a little planning beforehand? Yeah. So that's just my, and I think some people like Stephen King, what he does is the patterns in his mind. So he probably doesn't need to get out on paper because he's done countless freaking novels. I really haven't. I learned structure late in life. So, maybe on the 100th novel I won't have to do it, but not on the essentially what amounts to the second.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. And it's funny that you bring up King because I know that he's somebody who's like, well, I don't outline, I just kind of figure it out as I go. But he has multiple drafts. Like, there's no way he doesn't have multiple drafts. So, I mean, you kind of, that your first draft is your outline. I heard somebody else say that, and I was like, yeah, that's a good point. But
Just the
no, that,
best. So,
yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And so to kind of go from there, in terms of 904, a lot of what I felt like read as horrific to me were not necessarily the paranormal elements. It was the real world things, and that's a lot of the case with horror that we're reading today is, the paranormal elements help to elevate the real world things. And so a lot of the things that Olivia runs into, whether it's, she has somebody in her life who kind of won't let her go and his actions are kind of not so great. And then, I'm trying not to spoil anything, so I'm speaking in broad terms here, and kind of, some of like the internet interactions that she has with people, those are all very, very timely things. And so, it feels like a timely read for now. Whenever you sat down to kind of think about 904 and Olivia's story, was that always part of the plan, or was that something that as Olivia's story got told that you were like, no, this feels like this, if this book is going to be set this year, then this needs to happen?
yeah, no, I think, I'm a speculative writer, so obviously I believe in the imagination as much as I can, but I also pull from who I am and what I experience. And every single writer I know, with the exception of a handful, for whatever reason, has experienced absolute bananasness on the internet and sometimes even in real life. Like I've had to tell countless writers, oh, there's a service called Delete Me where it takes all your addresses and personal information off the internet so people can't stalk you. And what's happened, I used to be like, like it's 1996, the internet becomes a thing. I'm like, huh, what's this email address thing I've heard about? And then the early aughts, there's MySpace and blogs, and people are like, this is fun, and you're communicating. And then when people started talking about its negatives, I didn't really understand because I really had no public life. Yes, I was a professor. Certainly somebody could have decided to lie about me or say crazy shit about me, but why would they? Because they're not going to get attention. But then the minute, especially you, and the further, I mean, let me put this way: yes, the further from being a white guy you are, the more this is potentially going to happen to you. But Chuck Wendig, my God, that poor soul, like he has gotten it. He's a white dude who just happens to not be a bigot, and they will never let him forget it. And what people don't know is that in 86, Reagan eliminated the Fairness and Doctrine Act and eliminated the Broadcasting Act. And so I thought this was something that affected journalism. It just affected television and other like media like that or radio. So in other words, before that, if you didn't have two sides, you'd be fined. If you did a major falsehood, you'd be fined. And that's no longer the case. And it trickled down into the internet. It trickled down into newspapers and magazines. And then in 96, Clinton right? The internet's a thing. And he's like, well, you shouldn't be able to sue these companies for what people say, freedom of speech, right? And so that sounds great, except that what it means is that newspapers and magazines and people on the internet can say crazy, like shit about you, create complete falsehoods, and there are no consequences. And as far as the law is concerned in many states, via this something called anti-slap, you are a public figure. You as a writer, even if you make zero monies, and I do okay, but even if you don't, you are just like Verizon. You're a public figure, and so you cannot really be sued. I mean, you can sue for defamation, but the bar is unachievably high. So people on the internet, right? It's created a culture that now I've come to understand. There are people who are never going to write the novel, or if they do, it's it's not going to be good, or if it's good, it's not going to get attention. So, or they're pathological, or both. And so they just love something that you and I could never understand, which is harming people. They just enjoy it. And so ultimately, what this means is there are just people on the internet who create, careers and lives out of destroying other people. And if you're a writer, I would say that, you're quite vulnerable in this regard. So,
Yeah, one of the facets of 904 focuses a lot on this, and I thought that it was really, timely, especially, as somebody who has kind of grown up with the internet and like seen it even grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and there's no lid on it. There's no regulatory agency, there's no really rules or whatever, and that's kind of a fearful thing because, especially with the way that the world is moving, we keep growing in technology, and don't get me wrong, there's plenty of benefits to it, but I don't think anybody ever anticipated that the internet would take off the way that it has, the way that social media has taken off the way that it has. And of course, there are so many benefits, but there are so many drawbacks as well. And I think it's really interesting when you can find ways like in 904 to tell that story, to say, hey, here's where the harm lies in some of these things that, we take for granted. I mean, how many of us are just so used to opening our phones and hopping on social media, and there's a whole entire different side to that. So that was really interesting to me.
absolutely. No, and I think, I think now that you can monetize social media, right? You can, so that if you get more likes or more retweets, there are people who just do this on purpose. They bait on
Yeah.
purpose, they rage bait on purpose, and it affects the overall culture. And absolutely, in terms of where we're going, it's even more frightening because we're kind of in a fascist state right now. And so our information is going to be even more tightly controlled and rage baited in a certain direction. So yeah, I guess the book ended up being more timely than I realized.
Yeah, and like the other thing too is like even the commercialization of like social media. Like you said, everything's about money now. I mean, I remember whenever I downloaded TikTok in 2000 whatever, and it was just fun people doing stupid dances and shit. And now everything's an ad. Everything is a walking ad. And it's just like I had that realization the other day, and so it's just really kind of jarring. But again, it is cool that I think that you're able to present parts of this within your book that read as horrific, even though you're telling a story about ghosts and death and grief and all of these different things, we're still, you're able to put that in. So that was a really interesting component to me. And so to kind of go from there as well, we've talked about this a little bit with like genre classifications and things like that, but 904 does read a little, it's not procedural at all, but it has that, paranormal investigative component. So what's it, the writing process for writing investigation? I'm always intrigued in because, our world isn't so saturated with crime dramas on television and all these different things. And I find it's really interesting to know everybody's approach to writing a compelling crime or a compelling mystery. So what was that like for you?
Can't deny that my reading life is much more weighted towards horror, science fiction, and fantasy than crime. But a as somebody who is partnered to crime writer, my boyfriend David Haskell Wanley Wyden is the author of Winter Counts, right? I think about it a lot because he talks about it, and all he's ever doing is watching a crime drama, which is hilarious because he will watch like 50 children getting mowed down, but I'm watching a ghost story, and he's like, "No, I could never sleep if I watched that." you know. Um, so it always kills me, but pardon the pun. But yeah, I secondly, I admire crime fiction because of the way they plot and structure, because their audiences are pretty demanding that way. And as somebody who wasn't trained to do that, and I actually I worked for a little while reviewing books for publishers. Marketplace, is that right? I always conflate weekly and marketplace, even though I work for one. Um, I reviewed, and when people are mad at reviewers, they should remember something. Yes, some of them are assholes. Some of them are vengeful. There was a review I read recently. I was like, ugh, I know who wrote this. You know what I mean? And I know why, and fine. But for the most part, you're paid 25 bucks per book to do these reviews, right? So you either do it because you're like Gabino Iglesias, or me, like you want to change the culture. And if it causes a bunch of work in your life, you're going to do it. Or, you're a vengeful shithead, or you are somebody who otherwise has that time. So, in any case, I did review crime literature for them for a while, and I had the privilege of reviewing people like Rachel Hauser Hall, who really had not gone forward in her career in a way that I felt like she deserved. And recently, she was also in Good Morning America, and her book is like, the last one has really taken off, so that's wonderful. But yeah, I think why White Horse and The Haunting of Room 904 have sort of crimes at the center is because that is a way that I was figuring out how to do plot. And I
Yeah.
think that I'll probably be going a little bit more away from that with each subsequent book, not because crime isn't, a cool genre, but because I'm just a little bit more geeky at heart. So,
No, I
yeah.
totally understand that. But the cool thing about 904 is like, yeah, there is the crime component, but it's incredibly emotional as well because there's so much grief, right? Like Olivia is questioning her role in her sister's death. We get some exposition from her mother. And like I mentioned, there's a pretty wide cast of characters. So we see how this death has touched everybody's lives. And so I feel like, in a way, yeah, you hit some of the crime beats, but also there's a lot of character work as well that extends it elsewhere. So,
Absolutely. I think character is the heart of any good, book. That's just kind of me.
no, I agree. And I love whenever I can relate to a character, but I also really like whenever I don't like a character, but I find them compelling and interesting. That's something that I've kind of come across in my recent reading is like, well, I don't necessarily have to, like I used to be, before I really got deep into my reading and reviewing and stuff like that, it was always, good guy, bad guy. And I'm really happy to see that it's not so black and white and it's much more nuanced than that. Like I'm glad that my reading has taken me there.
Yeah, I think some people will argue, and I think that makes a lot of sense. Like, look, let a villain be a villain. Like, sometimes you got to let a villain be a villain. But what I found in terms of the complexity and believability of red herrings, for example, is the more you make the villain less villainous, the more you're disguising who done it. And that's just a fun process for a reader.
Yeah, that's very true as well. And I also wanted you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to bring it back. There's a good bit of commentary with academia, with Olivia's history, because she was somebody who, really had gone to school and she had gotten her doctorate, and then she finds herself in this career now that really, I don't want to say it doesn't have anything to do, because you always pull from that kind of stuff, obviously. But it's not where, everybody thought that she would be. So, can you talk a little bit about the role of academia within the Room 904?
Yeah, in White Horse, I wanted to honor, part of like I grew up in between Evergreen and Idaho Springs. Evergreen became slightly wealthy over time. Idaho Springs that took longer because it's all west of Denver. Um, and my mother had a college, like a 4-year degree. I have a PhD, and her mother had a fifth grade education. And so, those leaps have been really huge. And I went to school in Idaho Springs, which was really rugged at the time. So I wanted to honor the way in which people sometimes will look at working class people and say, oh, they can't be readers or they can't be knowledgeable. And I wanted to say, yes, they can. Because Carrie knows a ton about horror movies. She knows a ton about Denver. She knows a ton about horror fiction, and she's not stupid. But I wanted to go somewhere very different with Olivia and say, okay, on the other side of things, what happens when, you do come from people who've like moved up really hard in education, and then their kid does too. And so Olivia, right, is not in academia anymore, but she knows it. And then her friend Sarah is still in academia. And I wanted to talk about, well, I hate to say this because I gave it a positive spin in 904. I was trying to say, academia has the chance to be brave. But as we can see right now, Trump, the White Horse, has dropped an edict. you know, Colleges, universities, K through 12 have 14 days to eliminate all DEI or they will withhold funding, right? And some have immediately rolled over. And that is not their job. Our job is not to do that. Our job is to challenge. Our job is to see through shit. And so I gave Sarah um, the environment where, even though people in her background are saying, well, I don't think you're indigenous because you're Mexican, which is a constant ridiculousness in my own background and what I see in American Indian um, circles. And basically, it's the white guys which unexpectedly stand up for her and say, this is not intellectual freedom. And we're not okay with this. And they make a statement that's positive. Unfortunately, academia is largely not like that. They will, with the lack of funding, with the lack of that's happened over the past 20, 30 years, all the funding that used to go to colleges and universities now goes to job creators, i.e., corporations that don't actually make any jobs. And yet it looks good to taxpayers, right? And with the lack of tenure track jobs, like I think now we're nearing like 80% of all people teaching colleges are adjuncts. And these are people sometimes paid 1,000, 3,000 to teach a class. Academia, and it's run by a bunch of pseudo corporate people with PhDs who actually really don't know what they're doing in terms of running it like a business, which that's not what it's meant to be. And so oftentimes run into the ground, but are ultimately just, they make very cowardly corporate decisions, even though they don't really know how to run these institutions. And so, yeah, I wanted to at least show that that's unfortunately we look to, and I'm not anti-intellectual, I'm pro-intellectual, but I unfortunately most academics and academia, they're very, very, very cowardly, and that is sad to me because I
Yeah.
spent my life in it. I'm
Yeah.
always trying to get out.
No, I understand that for sure. And like I'm somebody who, my mother was an educator. She was a high school teacher for years and years and years. And so education was at the very forefront of my life. And then like I found myself working in somewhere that's not necessarily related to my master's degree. So I relate very much to the character of Olivia in that way. And there's this pedestal that education has been put on, but I feel like personally within the last like 20 years, I feel like academia in general has seen like a really big shift of where priorities lie and things like that. And of course, obviously, the things that you mentioned are the cause of those things. But it was another as part of the story, an asset that just added another layer of exposition and like character depth. And that brings me to my next question, which as you mentioned, you gave this character Sarah this background, and there are a lot of characters in the story who have very different backgrounds, and they kind of come together. It's like this found family kind of for lack of a better word, vibe, style of friendship. And so what was like, did you always set out to have this many characters and like their complexities, or was it like, well, I feel like, these kind of people, like what was it like to bring in all these kind of people? Because they were all pretty interesting for different reasons, and they all affect and influence Olivia in different ways. So I'm curious as to how it impacted the storytelling part of it.
Yeah, I saw Carrie as in Whitehorse as like a Gen Xer and a loner who kind of has to face like she does have a community. And that's definitely my generation is we're like, I don't even care. But really think about all the people that, you know, help you function. Whereas Olivia, I wanted to make her a bit more millennial, right? And from what I can see anyway, and this is a generalization, there's more of a sense of like found family and like, no, I don't have to go to my family reunion if they're assholes to me. And so I kind of wanted to talk about that. And for Olivia, right, Alejandro is her best friend from childhood, who's gay, who loves her, but just is kind of like, but will like whenever she gets too dramatic and too self-indulgent, it's like the end. Victoria's her friend. She's probably my favorite character because she's just like extremely mean and funny and smart and bored because she's a Mensa member and she's a real estate agent because making money is just so easy to her. So she can like spend her life doing what she wants, which is to have fun, right? And I feel like I grew up with and went to school with, and I'm friends with a lot of Diné people. And so I wanted to show like there's like I think that people like to think of natives in general as very sober, or I guess I know he's an ass, but like Alexi, like funny, 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 haha, in a very specific resi way. But I wanted to show a person from the res who is Danae, who is, yes, she comes from a traditional background to a degree, but is saucy and mean and fucking brilliant. And I just adore that character. And then Sarah is just very gentle. She's from a Catholic background. She's like a lot of other women I grew up with too. She is indigenous. She probably doesn't know what tribe she is, although sometimes folks do. And she values it though. She gets older and she's smart and she's like, I want to, spend my life, in academia. And so, yeah, I think what's really funny is my editor at one point was like, I just don't understand, why are these women so mean? And I was like, sometimes women are not nice. And I feel like too, now granted, even the white character, mean at times and very sarcastic, but I wanted to show like native characters kind of the way I experience them, right? Which is like varied and different and not what people think and not what people want to sell people. I don't know. So
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I really enjoyed, some of the funnier moments and it was very like no bullshit moments of the story, between her friends. And I really do love Olivia and Alejandro's relationship, the fact that like they live together and they're just there for each other. And, I mean, obviously there's some testing of friendships throughout the story, but that was a really different story to me, and I'd really enjoyed their dynamic, their dependency upon one another, but not necessarily codependency. They're, like they're relatively healthy. Like it was a nice partnership. So that was really, really interesting to read. And then the other thing that I have to ask, with Olivia, I feel like, in the realm of any kind of investigative story, there's always room for more. There's always another case, there's always or whatever. Have you considered telling more stories for Olivia, or is this full stop it for her?
I did see this as just a singular book, but I now have a manager through Sugar 23, and she was thinking the same thing I was, which is it has a very serialized potential. And so she's going to try in March when the book comes out. I'm just having the best time seeing your dog, like with the
She's
tail and
just,
the cute.
she
She's
is
just
a
truly like
full-on
a
heathen. Yeah.
yeah, she's like a bigger version of my dogs. It truly is. No wonder I'm like adorable. So but yeah, so she's thinking about trying to sell it, right, and that's always the ideal, to a production company to see if it could get, greenlit into a series because I think with the eBay listings, like I try to do it as Chuck
Yeah.
Palahniuk calls it, the nonfiction elements, right? So you have these like eBay listings of haunted objects, and sometimes it leads her to a case, and we realize right later that it's all kind of interconnected. But yeah, that's why. Yeah, that's why she thinks it could be sold in a serialized way, and I'd love that. I would love to be part of that process.
Yeah,
So
and like it naturally, like I could see where it could be, her investigating all these different things. And I'm glad that you brought up the chapter openers that you had for some of the chapters where it was the eBay listings. And I have to ask, like, how much research did you have to do for those to list them? It's different, like
oh,
paranormal investigative objects. Like, what was that like?
I love ghosts, real ghost time for real or whatever I called it. That
Yeah.
is actually based on a website that sells like paranormal equipment that I just love, and I always want to buy something just to do it. But as far as the objects go, I have always, again, it's just the geeky person in me. Like I want a portal, I want a haunted mirror, I want a haunted object. I'm obviously obsessed with the Conjuring series. I've read biography of you know Lorraine and Ed Warren.
Oh
They're
yeah.
so interesting to me. And I am obsessed with looking at haunted objects, especially haunted mirrors on eBay. I always look like there's a whole paranormal section in eBay about haunted objects. And so I'm always like, because most of the time it just seems like bullshit. But like every once in a while you're like, God, that's something else. And I always think like if I bought that thing, what would happen?
Yeah. Well, hey, for every object, you can have a different Olivia novel. I mean, that'll be your serialization right there.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about too. I love Mike Flanagan's work so much.
Oh yeah.
And of course, he'd be my dream to work with, but I don't see him doing that. I love it, but I don't see that happening. He's working with, Stephen King. But I love Oculus, which centers around a haunted mirror. And
Yeah.
yeah. And so, yeah, that's probably been in my mind ever since I watched it years ago and
Yeah, no,
rewatch it.
I love Mike Flanagan stuff, and I'm really interested to see what he's gonna. I have complex feelings about him doing Carrie, the limited series for Carrie, because while I am incredibly interested to see what Mike Flanagan's version of that is, I also am like, damn, like I would love a Duma Key adaptation. I would love like some other King adaptation. So we'll see. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's interesting what gets greenlit. You just sometimes don't know. And there are books, right, that like gosh, Percival Everett's Erasure, it's been out for 20, 30 years, and then suddenly, like, boom, this sort of experimental novel has turned into American fiction. And it's just like this huge phenomenon, right? So
Yeah, it is crazy what kind of gains momentum right now. But anyway, so is there anything about 904 that we have not talked about that you wanted to touch upon before we move on?
That's a really good question. I think we've covered most of the territory. I think in many, many ways, right? I hope it's fun. I hope it's smart. I, you know, I think the big thing for me as an Indigenous writer is I think the a lot of the problems around what arise around us is wanting this sort of authentic experience, like wear a bracelet, right? Oh,
Yeah.
am I buying an authentic bracelet or not? And it's just not a way to look at people or art. And so I'm always hoping that, like, the writer that I admire the most in this regard is Rebecca Roanhorse, because she is the best at just getting this organic, imaginative world that just has indigenous elements, but in a non, like, look at this authentic thing way. And so that's always my goal. That's my goal, is to write something that's really fun and engages being indigenous in a way that's for indigenous people too. It's not just meant to be like, see, I read this book, so I'm not racist now. So, or I
Yeah.
had this experience, right? So
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
those are my.
I don't think that anything ever really fits neatly into a box. And so anytime that you try and do that, that's whenever you kind of lose, I think, the point of creating art or telling stories that speak in that way. And so to have stories that are complex and messy with characters that are flawed and, all these different things, that's where you really win out. And so, I couldn't agree more. But I want to go ahead and ask, like, what do you have coming up for the rest of the year? I mean, obviously, The Haunting of Room 904 is coming out, but in terms of like, are you doing author events? Is there anything else that you have coming out? All of those things, like, what can we look for you for in 2025?
Yeah, so basically, I think I'm trying to remember when it comes out, but I am in the Titan Books anthology that Gemma Amor edited,
Oh
and now I'm
yeah.
forgetting what. Yeah, I know
I
I'm
think
forgetting what it's called,
Is
but
it Roots of My Fears?
yes, thank you,
Yes.
thank you. I
Yeah.
was like, it's just gone. It's just gone out of my head.
No, I
Roots of
get
My
it.
Fear. I have to admit, like, I don't write. I used to be crazy for writing short stories, but now I don't write them unless I'm solicited for a variety of reasons. And I think that one's just a wonderfully weird. It's one of my favorite short stories because it's sort of about this, like, hotel in the woods that is run by the Gan, which is what I hate the way this sounded in English, the little people. And so it just makes it sound like leprechauns, but that's actually a fair equivalent. But they don't know it, right? So this couple checks into this hotel in the woods, and it's got this strange, beautiful quality, mystical quality. The insides of it are like trees and branches, and it's moving, and the couple's fighting. And so, like, since it's like run by these supernatural creatures, the main character kind of suspects it, but she doesn't really know how to talk about it even to herself, right? So they're kind of moving through this experience in this hotel in such a way as to be just wonderfully weird. And so I kind of had to convince the editors to let it stay weird at the end. So there's that. And then, yeah, for The Haunting of Room 904, I am working on, or I am doing book festivals, author tours, and I'll probably put something up, very long story short, probably sometime in March about that. Like, I
Yeah.
tend to not put things up too early for a variety of personal reasons. And then I am working on a new book. It looks like it's about to be taken, and it's about an experience I had in Santa Fe where I went into the Loretto Chapel,
Oh
and
yeah.
yeah, I was just so traumatized, and I didn't know why. I had to leave. Like, I started I was like, I'm going to cry. I don't feel okay. And I don't have these kinds of experiences. That's really my mom or my auntie or my sister. I don't really have those. And my friend at the time was like, God, that's so res. And I'm like, I am urban. No, what? No. And it was so traumatic, I blanked it out. And then I went again with another native friend, forgetting I'd had this experience and had the same experience. And she said the same thing. Oh, that's so res. And I was like, what is in this place that is doing this to me? So I created a story around a couple that they're visual artists. They went to the Institute of American Indian Arts. They were academics for years, right? Academia coming back. And then they're able to be successful visual artists. They go back to Santa Fe to live. And one of them has this troublemaking gambling brother. So some more sibling stuff who has to live with them. And the husband's like, oh God, no. Because she's a muralist and kind of famous and is doing these projects. And then she suffers from depression. So, he's worried about her because the brother's like, I'm seeing things too in the house, and we have to figure out why. And then the husband is working on something called the Manhattan Project, an indigenous portal. So basically, the idea is like taking all the effects of on Hispano and indigenous people and talking about it and making it into an art installation, right? And so at a certain point in their old house that they bought, they find this doorway and the siblings break into it and they find like a series of basically portals. And so, it's like, okay, because as you can see, I'm kind of getting geekier as I go. So like it's like where do the portals go, and what does it mean to how does it relate to what they're seeing in the house? And how does it relate to the history of Santa Fe, the Loretto Chapel, etc. So yeah.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Loretta Chapel, that's the one with the staircase that is not architecture, like it's not supposed to be possible, right? Okay. Yeah, I've been there. I've been there.
It's a beautiful chapel. Like I swear to God, I've gone in there before and not had those experiences, but now I'll never go again. I see nothing,
No,
you
it's
know?
incredible. It's crazy to look at. I mean, I remember looking at it and being like, wow, like, you just kind of take a moment because it's so it like your mind kind of can't process what you're seeing in a way, because it's not how
Yeah.
it's supposed to look. But yeah, no, I mean, it was years ago, and I think I was in high school. I was on like a student council trip, so it was a long time ago. But yeah, no, I remember going there. That's really cool. That sounds like a really interesting story. And listen, the geekier the better, man. Like, I love that crap, so I'm all for it. Well, that's incredibly exciting. It sounds like you have a very busy 2025, and I will definitely look for your story in that anthology, Roots of My Fears. Thank you so much for your time, Erica. I appreciate you speaking so candidly about the book and your experiences and, your approach to writing this novel. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you wanted to mention?
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so honored. I had such a great time. Your questions were so perfect. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I just want to go ahead and express my gratitude one last time to Erica for her kindness, her expertise, and her time. I know that going on book tour and promoting your book is a lot of work and takes a lot of time, so it means everything that she took the time to answer my questions and talk about the haunting of room 904 as we discussed in this conversation. And I hope that you all enjoyed it, and I want to extend my gratitude to you all as well, everybody who's been listening, everybody, if you're here for the first time, listening for the first time, everybody who's ever reshared one of these posts to help promote this little podcast this one woman show. Just thank you oh so much. It means absolutely everything. Next week, I will be back with Philip Fracassi, and we're getting into sci fi territory. We're talking about time travel and his most recent novel, as of today, releases today as well, The Third Rule of Time Travel. So stay tuned for that. As always, again, just thank you guys so much, and I hope that you have a great rest of your week. Until next time.